everybody, this is James Lindsay, and you are listening to New Discourses Bullets, where I give a short bullet point-like summary of a single topic from woke that we need to understand so that we can defeat it. And in this episode, I'm not quite doing a commercial. I'm kind of explaining an idea that I have. It's a little kind of James Lindsay quirky about the Nazis. But I'm kind of doing a commercial for a long podcast series. I have no idea how long it's going to be. I don't know how many episodes, but I think it's going to be many. I have several more already that I'm outlining beyond the, 2.5, depending on how you count them, that already exist. But anyway, this podcast is about my framing of what happened in Germany from, I'm going to actually say, the early 1920s until 1945. And my framing, we all know what I'm talking about. We know what happened in Germany, culminating in disaster in 1945, and it's the Nazis. My framing is something I'm calling the Nazi experiment. And so the commercial is that the podcast series is titled The Nazi Experiment, with various volumes or episodes. And people can go and listen to what those specific episodes are. Most of them, but not all of them, are going to be reading from Mein Kampf, to show people what Hitler really thought and what he really decided he wanted to do, although there will be some other additions as well. That said, the question, or the topic of today's bullet, is why am I framing it as the Nazi experiment? I'm not calling it the Nazi catastrophe. I'm not calling it the Nazi atrocity, whatever else you want. And this isn't some weird, let's soften the Nazis thing. I want to actually get around that propaganda. And so the fact of the matter is that Germany, in the interwar period, meaning between World War I, which they lost, and World War II, which they started, in between those two wars, Germany had a unique or particular set of societal conditions. It found itself humiliated, impoverished, restricted by international treaty, particularly the Treaty of Versailles, which they found oppressive and unjust in many cases. They found themselves with a decadent, liberal, and I mean liberal in the continental soft sense, not in the American classical liberal sense, but a very decadent, liberal, even kind of flimsy parliamentary government that was not serving the interests of the people very well. And of course, these people were in a particular condition, which was not a particularly good condition after the end of the First World War. Again, humiliated, dejected, sanctioned by international law, looked down upon by most of Europe and much of the world. It wasn't a good time. But the decadence and weakness in the governmental sense to deal with that decadence and the other problems of the German society in the Weimar period also defined a set of conditions, which you might characterize as societal rot or decay. It's not just decadence, it's degeneracy. You will hear a lot of people in the group that I have, come to refer to as the woke right, pushing ideas, hey, what was the first thing? What were the first books the Nazis rounded up and burned? What were the first things that they really went after? And you find out that it was an awful lot of sexual degeneracy. Stuff that's not at all unfamiliar to us because of the way that pride has been presented to us over the last several years. And so they try to make this excuse for the Nazis, saying, it started off, the book burning and so on. And the woke left echoes this, by the way. They recognize this too. They think it's central. How terrible the Nazis were, that they were trying to destroy homosexual things and sexual decadence and liberation, and even kind of a very early version of trans. And so both the woke left and woke right, in opposite directions, use the same energy to talk about how this Weimar decadence which I'm not describing in full. I'm not a Weimar historian, so I'm not going to try to, but we know it's part of this condition, was a huge motivating factor for people to end up supporting the reactionary Nazis, which was a reactionary movement, not just reacting against the incursion of Marxism as it was trying to make its way into Germany, but also reacting to the decadence of society and the degeneracy of society and the weakness of the European-style liberals in their parliamentary government that didn't seem to have the ability to do anything about it. Carl Schmitt, who became known as the crown jurist of the Third Reich after he joined the Nazis immediately after Hitler took chancellorship in 1933, actually tried to stop the rise of the Nazis and the incursion of the Marxists before he became a Nazi. And when he became one, make no mistake, he went all the way. He went all the way Nazi. So he's not forgiven for this. This is a very important part of him, but this is not what this podcast is about. But he spent years reaching back to the early 1920s talking about sovereignty and political power in the executive, essentially to try to find a way to correct for these problems, these conditions, which he thought could be solved by greater executive power, what he called an unbound executive, who can recognize and name what he called the state of exception, where the laws are not adequate to cover the problems that the society is facing, so somebody has to be able to solve the problem, so it must be the executive who must be sovereign, who must be then unbound by law or constitutional law in particular to do what needs to be done to get things back on track. It's a sophisticated, but in my opinion, flawed argument, but he was doing this in the 1920s all the way up to 1932 when he's writing the concept of the political. And that just shows that there were these conditions that interwar Germany was in, that Hitler was able to tap resentment against. And so my framing is that the Nazi Party, as it rose up under Hitler and his associates, did an experiment. They did an experiment that when a society is plunged into the threat of Marxism and this decadence and this humiliation and this international sanction and whatever other trials and tribulations the interwar Germans believed that they were in, and in fact having lost much of their eastern territory as a result of the First World War and other wars before that, when you find yourself, a nation finds itself in these kinds of conditions, it has a variety of things it can do in reaction. And my framing is that the Nazis decided to perform an experiment. Here's a problem. We propose a solution. Hypothesis. This solution, the Nazi solution, will work to restore Germany to its greatness. In the podcast series, I go into great detail about what the Nazi experiment entails. That's what the series is about. We talk about the racialist worldview, for example, which is the Aryan stuff. I'm not going to get into it. We talk about the anti-Semitism and how that intersects with that. We talk about the Führer principle. We talk about a variety of things. Even eventually, maybe I'll set aside some time to talk about the stakeholder economy model that was first legally codified in 1937 in Germany, which I mentioned in a previous podcast as well. This was an experiment to solve a set of social, political, economic, and cultural problems in Germany that the Nazis proposed on the hypothesis that it'll work. It will rescue Germany and restore it to its greatness. And my point is, it failed. It failed utterly. It failed catastrophically. It failed atrociously. It failed grandly on a scale that few things in the history of the world have failed on. Mao's Great Leap Forward is comparable in its scale of its failure. Very few things. Some of the calamities under Stalin of the Soviet Union might come close to comparing, but almost nothing compares to the catastrophe that was visited upon the world and humanity and Germany itself by World War II. And World War II was a direct outgrowth of the Nazi experiment. So another point in the Nazi experiment that has to be raised is Hitler's overwhelming focus on battle. Battle is what defines humanity, what makes a man a man. Everything is about making a master race that can not just lead the world, but march into battle victorious. It's not just that the Jews and the inferior races in his racialist worldview existed and were a problem or mingled their blood, but that they demoralized the German people and caused them, both genetically and socioeconomically or culturally, degraded and degenerated them so that they lost World War I. And the cause of the defeat of Germany, that's really the true defeat, was, Hitler argues, not the military defeat, but rather the moral and genetic defeat that was caused far before the war was ever fought. Far before. And so the Nazis proposed this experiment to solve this problem, and it was one of the top 5 greatest disasters, one of the top 3 probably, or number 1 greatest disasters in all of human history. And so the conclusion is, why, James, would you frame this so gently? Why would you talk about the Nazi experiment as though it's just something in a laboratory, something to look at and study? Well, number 1, it's in the past. It is something to look at and study and learn from. But second of all, because I want to be able to bypass the propaganda. I frankly don't care what the Germans' perspective was. This is a huge point. Did Hitler just care about his people? What was the point? What did Germany really feel? We have propagandists out trying to rehash not just the history of World War II and Churchill's war, or role in that war, and FDR's role in that war, and possible alliances between the West and Stalin that were maybe a secret communist plot to undermine everything that Hitler was the last stand against. But we also have them trying to humanize the Nazi perspective. And frankly, Margaret, I don't care. The Nazis performed an experiment on a given set of conditions that a human society can find itself in. And the experiment returned a resounding failure, one of the most, if not the most, resounding failures in history. So, when we are tempted, as we are being tempted now by propagandists, foreign actors and bots, maybe our own deep state, who knows. When we are tempted to say, as the slogan is going in young, male, very online spaces, Weimar problems require Weimar solutions, and they're talking about the decadence and the weakness and the degeneracy of modern America and Canada and Australia and New Zealand and Britain and Western Europe. When they're saying Weimar problems require Weimar solutions, what they are saying is, and that is one of their little slogans, what they are saying is, we are in similar conditions that the Nazis found themselves in, or the Germans found themselves in. And then the Nazi Party came along with Weimar solutions, which is actually sort of a stupid way to phrase it. I get the linguistics, but it's a stupid way to frame it. So we were what they're saying is that America is in Weimar conditions, and so we should emulate the Nazis because Weimar problems require Weimar solutions. But the thing is, we ran that experiment. Weimar problems cannot be solved by what they are calling Weimar solutions. And that is why I think it's fruitful and useful to have a little, very difficult detachment from the Nazis and to look at it as a grand geopolitical, sociological, economic, and political experiment that failed almost as grandly and catastrophically as it is possible to fail. I once again insist that maybe only in terms of specific, relatively short-term catastrophes that Mao's Great Leap Forward is one of the only things that failed so spectacularly, which, by the way, I also think we should not emulate, even if we're calling it a Great Reset instead of a Great Leap Forward. Resets are leaps backwards, by the way. You think it's going to work? So that's why I'm calling this series The Nazi Experiment. I think we should think of it this way, at least in part, to answer the propaganda that we find ourselves facing. And I think it's going to be enlightening. But once again, one of the conclusions of the idea of the Nazi experiment is, frankly, Margaret, I don't give a damn. I don't care what the Germans thought they were facing. I don't care how oppressed they felt. I know that that's manipulable. I watched the Nazis manipulate it. I know that similar conditions exist in the United States, and I'm watching people manipulate it. What I am saying is that no matter how justified they felt in doing what they did, if we regard what the Nazis did as the Nazi experiment, we see that experiment failed and must not be repeated. Of course, there's only one thing to say to end this podcast, and I'll say it again. Never again is now.